applause. I didn't even say anything. Well, thank you very much, Richard, and thanks to Paul and Ziff Energy for inviting me to present at today's conference. It's a nice change to come down from the white and the cold to the green and the warm. Today I wanted to have a little bit of a casual and frank conversation with you about cost structure, about that illustrious position that we're all aspiring for to be the lowest cost producer. That's something that I think everybody in the room can relate to, especially our natural gas producers in the room. So next slide. You know, I think it's probably pretty common knowledge that the best insulation we can really find from a volatile commodity price is to be the low-cost producer. Quite frankly, we don't control the commodity price. We don't control the oil price. We don't control the gas price. So really, it's difficult for us. The only thing we do control is costs as producers. How does being the low-cost producer insulate you? I liken it to that old Canadian proverb that in order to outrun a grizzly bear, you don't have to be faster than the bear, just faster than your fellow hikers. So, you know, I think being a low-cost producer is very similar. You don't necessarily have to survive all the commodity price environment and all the commodity price volatility, but you definitely have to be better than everybody else so that you can survive. Next slide. The problem is finding out who is the low-cost producer because we're all claiming to be one. If anybody's looked through the company presentations, the quarterly report, the annual report, we're all the lowest cost producer, it seems. Or at least 90% of us are in the top decile of cost structure. And so it gets very difficult to see who really is the low-cost producer and why are they the low-cost producer. That's what we're really after. What things do they do that make them so low cost, and what things can we do, obviously, to get those same cost structures? Next slide. And it gets really hard with, I think, integrated companies that have a large basket of hydrocarbons. If you've got coal, bed methane, you've got tight gas, you've got shale gas, you've got oil sands production, you've got all these hydrocarbons in a basket, it's very difficult to look at a company's financial performance and say they're low-cost structure or they're a low-cost producer in any one of those different places or in any one of those different products because you can't see it directly. That data isn't so readily available, which is why we end up hiring guys like Paul and Ziff Energy to do specific play analysis for us. But it's very difficult to see. So I think it's really important to look at pure play producers. I do a lot of comparative analysis myself, and so I'm always looking for who is the low-cost producer in different plays, and you have to look to see exactly who in those plays are pure so that you can read through their financial results, so you can see in their quarterly reports and their annual reports just where their cost structure come from, if they really are low cost, and then you can start to dig into why perhaps they're a low cost producer. So next slide. And I think in the natural gas business there's some obvious standouts, some names that we recognize for sure. Down here in the US, you know, Petroleum in their Pinedale field, Southwestern in the Fayetteville. These are names that I think are synonymous with low cost producer status. I think everybody sort of recognizes these same names. And up in Canada, there's a standout too, and that is Peyto Exploration as a low-cost producer. And I think these are all guys that we can learn something from. And when we look at and analyze what it is they do in their operations and how they achieve such low costs. Next slide, please. And I think up in Canada, you know, as Paul was pointing out, it's even more important to be a lower cost producer than down here. You know, if you take, obviously we'd all like to have lots of oil production these days with the disparity between oil and gas prices, but if you take and normalize Alberta prices against Henry Hub prices, for instance, on the same units, you see we even get a lower price up in Alberta than you do down here. And I guess that makes sense in a way because we've got to pay to ship it. As much as I open up my windows and turn up my heat, we can't seem to consume all the gas that we produce. So we're shipping it all the way down here, and we've got to cover that cost. So generally speaking, we're getting a lower price up north than you guys are even getting down here, which makes it all the more important to be a low-cost producer. Next slide. So Paul asked, you know, could I do a bit of a case study of Peyto? Could I analyze Peyto from a cost perspective and maybe share some of the insights that I've learned about low-cost producers and something that we might be able to take away today? So let's have a look at Peyto. Peyto's a pretty generic exploration and production company, a publicly traded company on the Toronto Stock Exchange. You can look us up, symbol PEY. We produce about a quarter of a BCF of production a year. So, you know, 40,000 barrels a day, it's a fair amount of production. 85, 90 BCF a year, which means that, we produce enough energy to probably heat, cool, and power the city of Houston for a year, which, that's a fair amount of energy. Production split 90% gas, 10% natural gas liquids, so a pure natural gas producer. Reserves here are 2011, the 2012 reserves were just released, a little over a TCF now of producing reserves. And on a reserve to production ratio, that's well over 10 years, so a 10-year plus reserve life index, long life reserve assets in this company. Very pure play company though, entirely concentrated in the Alberta Deep Basin. So we can look through the company's financial performance, we can see the numbers, we can figure out whether they're low cost or not. The enterprise value of Peyto is about $3.2 billion, and maybe as a first clue on the low costs, they have 35 full-time employees. That's it, for 40,000 BOEs a day. I think, as Mike Watford puts it, that's a very high gas-to-ass ratio. It was funny, I was reading on the plane down here about the Albanian National Oil Company. They have 4,000 employees and 2,400 BOEs of production. That's the opposite of a high gas-to-ass ratio. Next slide. So if we look at Peyto's track record over the last 10 years, we see sort of a consistent theme here. All-in cost to build it of $1.85 an MCFE. And when I say all-in, I mean all in. So this is all the land dollars that were ever spent, all the seismic that was ever shot, the wells that were drilled, completed, equipped, tied in, all the facilities ever built, any acquisitions that might have been done over that period, not that we did any, and all of it measured against the change in proved producing reserves. So very critical way of looking at how much does it cost to build the next BOE of production. A lot of companies, a lot of guys might use depletion in this stance. Problem with depletion is usually calculated, it's your PP&E depleted over, say, your total proved reserves. And total proved reserves, of course, includes an undeveloped component, which unfortunately there's some uncertainty there with respect to how much capital are we going to spend, how much reserves are we really going to get. So I don't like looking at depletion so much. And up in Canada now it's even worse with IFRS. Companies are depleting over P plus P reserves, so 2P reserves, which is even more uncertainty. I think looking at PDP FD&A is a much more critical way of looking at how much a true new barrel of production really costs to build. So $1.85 an MCF over the last 10 years. The total cost to produce at $2.60 an MCFE. So, and that's, again, all costs are rolled in here. So lease operating expenses, processing charges, transportation charges, interest, G&A, royalties, production taxes, even stock-based compensation. Let's throw that into. Everything's in the bucket here in terms of total costs, which have averaged about $2.60 over the last 10 years. So $1.85 to build it, $2.60 to produce it out, $4.45 an MCFE in total, and the company's selling on average for about $7 an MCF. And so there's some liquids content in here. In terms of natural gas liquids, we saw 11% natural gas liquids was boosting the price a little bit, and some heat from that natural gas too. But more importantly, maybe even than the numbers, is the fact that over a 10-year span, there's a consistent 40% wedge of profit here. And that really, I think, speaks to the advantage that low-cost producers enjoy. It's the resiliency throughout the commodity price cycle, whether we're down at $2 gas or up at $14 gas, sometimes in the same year. It's, consistent cost structure, consistent profitability. Next slide. And this isn't necessarily unique to Peyto. I think a lot of low-cost producers look like this. So if you look at Petroleum the same way, for instance, we can see exactly the same kind of thing. $1.67 to build it, $1.35 to produce it, and they're selling it for $5. Again, generating close to that 40% margin. So consistently having built it and produced it for far less than they're selling it. Next slide, please. So I guess the biggest question for all of us here is, what can we learn from that? What do we take away from these low-cost producers, from analyzing them? How do they do it? How do they get those low costs? And what are the common themes that we might see amongst low-cost producers that maybe we can try to apply at our own companies? Next slide. And I think achieving low-cost status is really about choice. It's really about what you choose to do. Both Ultra and Peyto, for instance, are very returns-driven companies. They don't spend a dollar if they can't generate a very high rate of return on that dollar. I think low-cost producers tend to be very low risk. They tend to avoid a lot of exploration. They tend to want to do development work. They tend to avoid plays with high risks. Low-cost producers, I think, are generally pure play producers. These are guys that know what they do well and they stick to it. They do only maybe one thing, and they do that very well. And I think low-cost producers tend to want to own and control as much of the value chain as they possibly can. And they believe in what they're doing. So they believe in organic development. Low-cost producers very rarely make acquisitions, I find. And lastly, I think low-cost producers, because of the confidence in what they've built, they're able to forward sell it. They're able to take advantage of future prices. They're able to lock in, as Paul was talking about, that future strip. Next slide, please. And so much as it's about the choices that you make, I think it's the commitment to those choices demonstrated in what you don't do. You know, low-cost producers like Peyto, we don't chase sour gas because we know it's high cost. We don't chase reservoirs that produce water because we know those are high cost. And low-cost producers don't tend to diversify their portfolio base. They don't have some gas and some oil and some projects here and some projects there. It's a little like that Warren Buffett belief that, you know, diversity is for those that don't know what the hell they're doing. You know, low-cost producers don't tend to joint venture. They don't tend to want to share. And like I said before, they don't tend to make a lot of acquisitions. Because generally speaking, if what was for sale was so good, probably wouldn't be for sale in the first place. Next slide. So when I mentioned low-cost producers tend to focus on returns, you know, if you want to generate maximum returns, you can't really be investing all the time. I think these are, I'm not saying anything really earth-shattering here. This is sort of logical stuff that if you want to invest for maximum returns, you want to try and be counter-cyclical. We all know what it's like doing economics at the top of the commodity price cycle. Sure, budgets are fat, everybody's flush with cash flow, the price of commodities are high, and you're busy looking at the rate of return of your projects and you're saying, oh, I can generate 30% rate of return on the forward strip here. But the problem is you're at the top of the commodity price cycle, and likely you're not going to get that commodity over the long term. Likely it's going to be something less than that, and probably then your returns are going to be something less than that. Whereas if you're at the bottom of the commodity price cycle, say like we are now with gas production, and if you can get 30% rate of return on the forward strip, then you're probably going to do even better than that. You're probably going to get something stronger than that over the long term because the long-term commodity price is going to be stronger than that. And so sure, this is easy. We all want to invest at the bottom of the commodity price cycle and not at the top. But then the rub is that when you're at the bottom of the commodity price cycle, nobody's got a lot of cash flow. Everybody's budgets are pretty thin. Nobody's getting approval for their projects. So this is where being the low-cost producer comes in. If you're the lowest cost producer, you're generating the maximum amount of cash flow at the bottom of the commodity price cycle. You can be the most aggressive at the bottom, and you can generate the most returns. So maybe it's not surprising that either low-cost producers focus on returns or returns have come out of low-cost production. Next slide. And I think low-cost producers tend to focus on low-risk assets too. Peyto, for instance, we're entirely focused in the Deep Basin of Alberta, and this is a very interesting area. I don't know if everybody's familiar with the Deep Basin and the trap mechanism that we've got up there, but it's quite different. Instead of conventional sort of hydrocarbons on top of water, we got the reverse in the Deep Basin. We've got hydrocarbons underwater. We've got gas in the bottom in the down dip position, oil up dip of that, and water even further up dip of that. And you say, well, that's all wrong. Pour it in the glass in front of me. Water's the densest, it's on the bottom, the oil floats on top, the gas bubbles through. But we've got these very fine-grained sandstone reservoirs tightly compacted together, a lot of overburden pressure, so very low permeabilities. And as a result then, the gas can't migrate into the up-dip position because fluids can't physically get down there to replace them, to displace them into the up-dip position. You've got what's sometimes referred to as a permeability or a hydrodynamic trap. And so it's interesting because when you drill a well into the gas-bearing part of this trap and you deplete the pressure, fluids don't rush in to replace the void. You never have the risk of a well watering out. You never have water encroachment, water production, and we all know water production leads to operating costs. So I think low-cost producers in general, they like the predictability of low-risk plays, and they tend to direct their asset base that way. Next slide. Peyto is, like, as I mentioned, a pure play company. All of its assets focused in the Alberta Deep Basin. These are liquids-rich, tight gas reservoirs, typically generating some natural gas liquids, 30 barrels a million or so. But a very high level of ownership and control, which is quite unique. Over 99% of the production is operated by Peyto. 98.5% of that production is processed through one of Peyto's 5 100% owned and operated gas plants. So they really do own from the reservoir right to the sales meter, the entire value chain there. And I think that's important. When you think about trying to lower your operating costs, usually it helps to be the operator of the production to try and lower your costs. I haven't found too much success picking up the phone, phoning the operator of other production and saying, could you lower the costs, please? So, I think generally low-cost producers tend to want to own and control as much as they can. Next slide. And low-cost producers, as I mentioned, they want to build it themselves. Everything that Peyto owns today, all 40,000 barrels a day, we went out and found and developed ourselves. And I think it's a pretty common theme amongst low-cost producers. Guys like Southwestern in the Fayetteville, they drill it all up themselves. Ultra in the Pinedale, they drill it all up themselves. All these low-cost producers, I think, a common theme, they want to build it themselves. They have confidence in their ideas and in their ability to execute on those ideas. Next slide. And if you have built a good product, then I think you can also forward sell it with confidence. You can take advantage of that future price, if you will. And so Peyto has a bit of a unique hedging strategy as well, where we're layering in fixed price swaps, very small amounts of production, forward selling it every month into a 2-year out price window. And we're doing it very mechanically, very systematically, little like dollar cost averaging when you buy stock. And so as a result, we're really not trying to speculate on what the price is going to be. We're just consistently taking that future price off of the table. And so we're smoothing out the volatility in the commodity price. But it's interesting because over a cycle of gas prices up and down, you would think then that you'd be behind on your hedges on the way up and you'd be ahead on hedges on the way down. And probably at the end of the day, you'd be sort of net-net. Come out with no win, no loss. But what we found is we're actually significantly ahead using this strategy. And it's kind of interesting. And I think the reason that we're ahead is because we're actually getting paid a little bit of a premium for security of supply. When you look 2 years out, prices 2 years away they're not typically discounted. When we all think about time value of money, any number in the future, you bring it back into today's timeline, you should be discounting it back into today's dollars. But typically forward prices aren't discounted. So you're getting that little bit of a premium, maybe that discount every year as security of supply. And so you're getting paid that little bit of a premium. Next slide. As I mentioned, low-cost producers are lean and mean. Peyto's a great example of that with 35 head office employees. We've only got about a third of our staff administration, very technical weighting. A lot of landmen, engineers, geologists, technical people working in the company. And with 99% of the production operated, we have one joint venture accountant. You can think about for every 40,000 barrels a day your company has, how many joint venture accountants do you have chasing your production around? Phoning up, trying to find your production, your revenue every month. And when you're all organic, when you've built it all yourself, you have very few people required to run it. We've got only 3 production engineers, 1 facilities engineer for 40,000 barrels a day, 5 gas plants. It's a little like building your own house. If you were there, you were doing the framing, you were doing the electrical wiring, you were running the plumbing, you know where everything is. And so when the walls are all boarded up and 5 years later you've sprung a leak or you've got a short, you know exactly where to look. And it takes you very little time to fix it. But if you bought your house and you've got a leak or you've got a short, you're on the phone to a plumber, electrician, everybody's trying to figure out where the hell this problem is. It costs you a lot and takes a lot of time. Whereas if you've built it yourself, you know exactly where to go to look. And so building all your asset base yourself takes very little people to actually run it and to maintain it. And there's the pros, obviously, having a lean staff, low G&A, very efficient, flat organizations, all the rest of it. And there's a few cons, too. You've got to have vacation coverage. You don't want to burn people out if you're too lean. And ultimately, you're a little bit vulnerable, perhaps, to being poached by other operators. But I think the pros obviously far outweigh the cons in terms of cost advantage. Next slide, please. So how do the numbers compare? I mean, in Peyto's case, for instance, what does being a low-cost producer get you? Well, it gets you operating costs that are a third to a quarter of the industry average. It gets you finding costs that are half the industry average. And it gets you profit margins that are not only positive, but handsomely so relative to an industry that's really struggling. Next. And, these are sustainable cost advantages. This is enduring cost advantage. We're all fighting inflation every year on our operating costs. We're all seeing labor costs going up. We're seeing chemical costs, power costs. Everything's inflating. We're always fighting to try and keep operating costs down. But those high-level choices get you a very sustainable cost advantage that actually grows over time relative to the industry, which is interesting. Folks, there's no rocket science here. Peyto doesn't have any proprietary operating techniques. There's no technology that we're using that you're not using. We have operators driving to wells every day, checking them. We've got standard health, safety, environment programs in place. We're not cutting any corners. There's no magic here. Just high-level choices that are built to deliver a very low-cost advantage, which is very sustainable. Next slide. So, just to sum up, I think low-cost producers, what do they do? What do they do so well? What are those common themes? I think they stick to what they know. They do what they do best. And they tend to focus on low-risk assets, assets that they understand, that they know they can deliver a low-cost environment with. And contrary to what your mother always taught you, they don't share. You don't want to share your ideas. You don't want to share your asset base. You want to own and control as much of it as possible. And I think you want to build it yourself. You want to build in that low-cost advantage. And then if you stay lean enough, you can be very aggressive at the bottom of the commodity price cycle and make maximum returns. And so maybe next year, instead of me standing up here telling you about how we're a low-cost producer, next slide, it can be you. Thank you.